Welcome back, you whiskey ambassadors, to Whiskey One, the channel for the novice, the curious, and the connoisseur. So today I'm very excited to be tasting the Booker's Bourbon. So stick around. Booker's Bourbon, Kentucky straight bourbon at that. These are uncut, unfiltered, no water added. No shenanigans. They are basically bottled exactly as they are in the barrel. And I'm very excited to be tasting these with you. And I wanted to talk about recent changes to their price points at that and see if they still hold their value and if they're still worth it. Alright, so these are Booker's Bourbon, named after, most notably, Booker No, who introduced this in 1992 as small batches. And he coined the phrase small batches simply because these were meant to be the finest barrels that were in their rick houses or their center cut, also known as their sweet spot. And for the most part, these are supposed to be the top of the line from the Beam Distillery. So I wanted to taste these with you and just kind of go over some notes, talk a little bit of history, not too much into the history, but most notably get into this recent change with their prices. Now, these are supposed to be top of the line bourbons. And for the most part, you can expect to shell out a little extra cheddar for some top of the line stuff. But there becomes a point where you start to maybe drop a little too much and start to ask yourself, is it still worth it? Is it still really got that value? What are we doing here, right? So let's pour and talk about these unique batches. So this is the 2017 04 batch, and this is known as the Awhile batch. I've seen folks do reviews on different Bookers and even do like a head-to-head tasting with different batches, and this one seems to be the one that really strikes it deep and hits the right notes for some. And I gotta say that I'm interested to talk about it and also reveal that I too find it to be an excellent batch. Now this is the 2020 01 batch, or Granny's batch to be specific, and this is this year's first batch. I had a chance to already do a neck pour of it, and I'm interested to see just how well it fares with the 2017. So not only are we going to talk about prices, but we're kind of see if over the years Booker's has either lost its touch or has become a little overpriced or overinflated for what it delivers. I've got some water here because these are basically barrel proofs, so let's dive in. Starting with color, they both have this rich, deep amber color, almost like a mahogany or a dark chestnut, and as one would expect from a barrel proof and not being watered down, they're going to have that dark, intense coloring to them. And they don't add any coloring or anything like that. So what you see is what you get right from the barrel. So let's go in for the nose on the Awhile. Rich vanilla, dusty peanuts, real nutty and oaky forward, but it's also sweet. And one thing that you typically get from those rich and intense bourbons is vanilla and molasses, caramel. You get that oak. Sometimes the distiller will overdo it, let it age a little too long, and be too oak forward. But I gotta say this Awhile is really nice on the nose. It's not very oak forward. It's just there hanging out and playing nicely. And it's got a little bit of spice, just a tad bit of that cinnamon spice right on that end there. Now I'm going to let these breathe a little bit as we start to go over these noses and let them just kind of evolve a little bit. Let it sit in the glass. And you typically want to do that for like a cask strength or a barrel proof type of whiskey. So, the Granny's batch. Now this one's a bit different. It's got a bit of a synthetic smell to it. I'm not getting as much vanilla that I get from that Awhile, but I am getting like oak. I am getting like dusty peanuts or like a dusty warehouse type of smell. One thing I'm not getting is a lot of caramel presence. It's faint, very subdued here. And something that's a little off-putting is that synthetic smell that's just kind of lingering there, almost like a plastic or a rubber smell. Okay, so I'm gonna set this one down and just kind of talk about these batches. Now, every batch is released about 4 times a year, and they all have their like unique story. And as you can see, they have really, really nice like cases here. I have them on the top of my bar because they're fancy and they really kind of are a conversation starter, really. And they all come with an individual leaflet to kind of go over their individual story on why they named each bottling a specific batch. And I gotta say that every batch is pretty interesting. They have a lot of detail about how much from each barrel comes from a specific warehouse, and really what's the overall story, the gist behind the bottling, which is very cool in my opinion. So I'm gonna set these down and let's dive into this sip a while. All right, now you might have noticed that as I was sipping that initial sip, I started to do what's referred to as that Kentucky chew, just chewing on it, letting that whiskey roll from the front to the middle to the back of the palate and just let it coat all the way through. This is a viscous, heavy, dense, and oily bourbon, but so intense. Now on that taste, rich with vanilla, caramel, I would dare say toffee, right? It's a little bit darker brown sugar, really dense with that sweet undertone. And then just behind it's just that oak, just hanging out, just enough to let you know it's there, but it's not oak dominant in any way. This sip a while is delicious. This was the reason why I started actually collecting Booker's bourbons. So let me take one more sip. Man, toasted marshmallow, peanuts, but it's dusty peanuts, and it's got a nice, beautiful cinnamon spice that lingers. The finish is really, really long and pleasant. It just gives you that coating all the way down to your belly as you swallow that whiskey, and it's just a beautiful bourbon. Again, this is the reason why I fell in love with Booker's to begin with. So I'm gonna set this down. And now we're going to try the Granny's batch. Alright, so before I dive in, I better get a sip of water here, cleanse that palate. These are really intense bourbons. Okay, the Granny's batch. This is a new batch release from 2020. And like I said, on that nose, it was a little bit synthetic and rubbery on that nose, a little bit too pronounced. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but let's dive into that taste and hopefully it tastes pretty darn good. Okay, now this is very different than the sip a while. This is more spicy, oaky. It's almost got a little bit of a higher rye mash bill in it, if you will. It's just got a bit of a more pronounced anise and fresh cut grass character that the sip a while doesn't really have. Super dense with molasses as well, but I want to lean more towards that toffee. Not as much vanilla, and not as sweet, but dense, rich, and dark type of like a brown sugar or something like that. And if you've ever had the top layer of a creme brulee, you know, that toasted caramel that's just right on there and it's really, been cooked and really dark, that's what it tastes like. And it's still sweet, don't get me wrong, it's just not as vibrant sweet. It's more of a dense sweet. All right, so now I'm gonna cleanse the palate again and go back to that sip a while. Now, one thing I didn't really get into is the differences in the aging and the proofing. So for the sip a while, it's 64.05% ABV and it's been aged for 6 years, 8 months, and 14 days, while the Granny's batch has been bottled at 63.2% ABV and aged at 6 years, 4 months, and 21 days. So let's cleanse that palate and take one more sip. So getting on that sip a while, one more sip. Man, that is just a delicious bourbon. I gotta say, it's one of my favorite bourbons, to be honest with you. Going back to that taste, one thing that I'm also kind of catching on the taste and that palate is more clove, and it's not that fresh cut grass that's really pronounced like the Granny's batch, but it's more of a subdued clove, cinnamon. It is spicy. I would have to say it's just not as spicy as this Granny's batch, and it's just really rich with vanilla and caramel and toffee, and oh man, it's just a beautiful, delicate balance with that oak, and it's really surprising because it's a barrel strength. So let me take one more sip and get into this Granny's batch. All right. So that whiff of synthetic rubbery smell is a bit on that taste. Again, I'm not sure what happened here. It could be that I just got a bottling that, maybe during storage or transit to, the store, it just sat in heat and it didn't do it any favors, right? Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But that is definitely something that's standing out. And as I try to get past that synthetic taste and aroma, one thing that is definitely standing out is that it's a bit more spicy and oaky forward. The oak presence is probably the most dominating thing on the taste. You do get vanilla, but it's just not quite as sweet. You get a little bit of that toffee caramel, sure, but it's just kind of overpowered by that spiciness, that anise and fresh cut grass that's there. And then the cinnamon spice hangs out and it just doesn't want to let go. Right on that finish, it is very, very long. And one thing that I need to add, as far as the historical content of this tasting, is that, Booker, before he retired, he asked his son Fred, one last request, and that was make sure that they don't mess with my Bookers. Now, as you can see, these are, different bottlings separated by about 3 years. And I gotta say that the 2017, for me anyway, is my favorite between the two. Now the 2020, let's think about this. So this is an intense bourbon, but I gotta say, I don't think it really does as well as the Sip Awhile. And one thing to note is this price point that I wanted to talk to you about. So between the time that I got my hands on the Sip Awhile, I probably spent between $65, $70. And I thought that that was quite a bit, but it was well worth it. It is still well worth it, in my opinion. Now, this one is currently retailing for about $100. Now, I chose not to buy it at $100. I kept hunting around, and I was able to find it at a store that sold it for $82. Now, I knew up front that there was some mixed feelings, some different reviews about the new 2020-01 Granny's batch, and that it wasn't really worth it. And I had to see for myself, right? I didn't want to judge a book by its cover or just take anybody's word for it. So I made the plunge, I bought the bottle, and I gotta say, for $100, I don't think that it's worth it. For $80, it's a judgment call. I got it just because I'm honestly a collector of Booker's bourbon, and I try to get my hands on every batch just to see, how they taste differently from year to year, from batch to batch. And I gotta say that even though they're hiking up the prices, I don't know that it's still well worth the value or the price that I'm paying for it. So I'll leave you with that. Booker's bourbon is a phenomenal bourbon. I don't want to take anything away from these guys. They make excellent whiskey. But I think that over the years, if this is a representation of what, the new batches are going to feel like and taste like, they probably need to drop that price back down and spend a little bit more time in that rick house. So with that being said, I'm going to choose a sip a while. And if you have a chance to get your hands on a Booker's, I do suggest you get it, but you may want to start looking around for those older releases, those older batches. Maybe this year it has some different batches that are tasty and taste a little better. So I'll leave you with that. Overall score. This Booker's Sip a While for me is definitely a 4.75 out of 5. Now for this Granny's batch, this one is going to feel more like a 4.25 out of a 5. And for me, that's kind of, even though it's a good score, anytime I come across a barrel-aged whiskey, it's going to usually fare a little higher because it's just going to be more intense, more vibrant, a lot more going on, and definitely a lot more character and uniqueness. But comparing the two, this is definitely setting itself apart. Now, who knows? Maybe these other 2020 releases are going to be a lot better, but I'll leave you with that. So, I just want to say thank you guys for joining us here today. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. We have different postings, so always follow us and see what we got coming up. And for you joining today, we leave you with this. Remember, Whiskey One, it's about the one you enjoy. Cheers.